Hello, welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, company that audits algorithms for ethical risk, effective governance, and bias. I am joined by Abhi Sanka. Abhi, thank you so much for joining us. So I know Abhi because Abhi was sort of in the inaugural class of the AI and Algorithm Auditor Certificate Program, which has now become a certification program, which was a bit of an experiment for Babel. But as soon as I realized we can attract students like Abhi, I realized that this was clearly we're onto something. I was super excited. So I'm not going to do you justice introducing you, but I'd love to hear, in your own words, a little bit about yourself and sort of how you got to this where you are now, which is sort of at the center of things of responsible AI.
Yeah, thanks, Shay. Happy to be here. Glad to have me. I'm very nostalgic for when I first met you back in I think May of last year. When I first joined the BABL certificate program, and that was such an awesome experience. So I at the time when I started the program, I was supporting government. I spent about 4 or 5 years or so in government, supporting a couple of different federal agencies. But I really like to, when I start talking about my career and interest, I really like to start before then, which is sort of who I was in undergrad and in college. And I studied, when I was at Duke, the history of the Human Genome Project, and sort of had a background, undergraduate background in bioethics and, the ethics of genetic testing and gene patenting. So that's really where I felt like my science policy journey began, in sort of the life sciences space. And there was a lot of themes that are still present today, in terms of like interpretability and explainability of genetic testing results to patients, and what does that mean, to their world and life when they get certain results. So I like to start there in terms of like sort of my foundational training, and who I was really as a person is studying sort of bioethics, and then also the social and political history of how the NIH and the Department of Energy funded the Human Genome Project, and sort of their work with the private sector as well, and Francis Collins, Eric Lander. So really kind of like to start there, and then did a little bit of that work in my first year or two after undergrad, before then joining supporting government. First at a place called the Science and Technology Policy Institute, which is essentially like a federal lab supporting the White House Science Office. So the most well-known sort of lab agency relationship is like Caltech's Jet Propulsion Lab, and the way they support NASA. So that's sort of how for 2 years I was a fellow supporting the White House Science Office, really at doing science and technology policy at that highest sort of 10,000-foot level, writing national strategy reports on things like workforce development or R&D spending. So that was under 2018 to 2020 in the first Trump administration term. Then did a very brief stint at Deloitte supporting the U.S. Treasury Department on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. And then when I met you, I was at another consulting firm called Ardent, and supporting the General Services Administration. And that's when I got really more into federal agency use of emerging technologies and policy, guiding agencies on how to adopt different emerging technologies and what considerations they need to use to like align technology deployment with existing policies like OMB memos or the NISRS management framework or existing executive orders. And that was when I met you, and that was sort of that big generative AI wave last year, and sort of that real interest and drive to kind of getting a little bit more formal training in responsible AI before joining industry at the beginning of 2024, now with Microsoft. So yeah, that's the full life cycle of my journey in a nutshell.
Wow. Yeah, it's quite a journey. So it's so interesting that, I mean, in some sense, it's apropos that you started out doing research with the Human Genome Project, because in some sense, and maybe you tell me, I feel like the AI transformation that's happening right now in terms of like the societal impact feels a little bit like the Human Genome Project, where it's something that is the whole world is partaking in, being led, of course, by different countries, different labs, and things like this. But it's something that will impact the entire world. It's something that we need a lot of resources to do, and we don't know fully what the ethical implications are, or we don't fully understand what the ethical implications are. Do you feel like there's some parallels there?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a big believer in studying history and understanding how certain initiatives or certain aspects of science policy were created. So, for example, one of my former professors, he really helped work on ELSI, conceiving of the term ELSI, ethical, legal, and social implications of genetic testing, and so he talks about this meeting at the National Academy of Sciences where those were discussed, right? And sort of the different aspects of NIH, which the National Institutes of Health, which sort of grew up around those types of movements. So there's definitely a lot of themes that, or just us recognizing that, we'd like to think a lot of the issues that we're grappling with are new, maybe, but there are predecessors in, the world of bioinformatics and data handling of different types of data with different sensitivities, right? And the ethics of gene patenting was a big thing. People probably now think, oh, how could you patent a gene? But that there was this patent on the breast cancer gene for a long time that was struck down by the Supreme Court. And that was a really, really big thing that happened my first year at college, 2013. So, yeah.
Wow. So, okay, so where you're working with the government science policy, you are kind of moving into more tech AI focused. At what point did you say to yourself, like, I need to go study something more? I need to expand my knowledge. Like, what was the trigger for that? What was it? Just because you're the kind of person you are and you're curious and you want to grow, or was it sort of more of a confluence of other external things?
Yeah, so I think when I first started supporting government, I definitely wanted to expand a little bit outside of just the life sciences. So there was a lot of life sciences work I did in my fellowship, but also wanted to learn about other emerging technologies. I did some work around the electric vehicle battery supply chain, did some work around a little bit of work around quantum. And I think the first real AI project I did was in support of the first AI executive order that was signed under the Trump administration. Um, and that was around workforce development and which programs by the NSF or NIH could be prioritized, which workforce development postdoc and doctoral fellowship programs funding wise could be prioritized for investment for AI. I think to answer your question though, when sort of I had that real desire to um, get into this current sort of space, very specific to AI, was sort of the generative AI wave last year. I did a lot of writing in my last role, maybe like 200 or 300 pages worth of writing on government use of AI and informing sort of more senior folks at GSA and federal agencies on recommendations of how to use it. So I think I just developed a passion and an interest in that. And then that brought me to Babel in terms of, well, there's the traditional AI policy or science policy background that I have, but to kind of get deeper into sort of like the product oriented assessment, right, or auditing of AI systems. I think there was some of that I learned a little bit in the context of genomics in undergrad, but I think that's what drove me to this appetite for more training, right? And I feel like it's probably a lot different at the beginning of 2023 to now, right? I think you've probably probably done a lot of work, and maybe I have to get trained again. But it was a great introduction to the world that you inhabit.
Well, I think so. I think you probably don't. Like, I think all of us need to train in emerging technology more, right? We have to understand how things work in order to know how to govern them. Like at a certain level, you have to understand how things work because there will be, and you probably will remember from the program our emphasis on this connection between sort of risk and technical controls or technical testing, and making sure that those are really tightly connected. You understood the risks and you could understand how. And so you need to know the technology to do that. But to be honest, like the more we've worked, the more we've realized how sort of germane some of those basic principles, some of the first principles of risk assessment and governance and that kind of thing don't go away. Like they're still relevant, and so yeah, I think that the that's still there, and I'm actually curious how, because we talked to Sorabel, who is another graduate of the program, but it's I'm always curious, like what how was that experience for you, and then how has that translated, if at all, to some of the work that you now do with Microsoft, or work that you just do on your own. Like how was that experience, and how has anything translated, and if so, kind of what are the elements that did translate?
Yeah. So I think one of the most I was just reviewing some of the work that before we chatted, some of the work that I'd done during the certificate program, and some of the basics like the CETA framework. I think are things like some very fundamental things that when we think about, the NIST risk management framework and sort of the structure on map, measure, manage. I think understanding the context of a system's being deployed, sort of the intended uses. Those are a lot of very similar to sort of the principles that we have in Microsoft as well. Um, so I think working. I remember chatting with Sorabel and Luna, and working with a lot of the folks that went through the program. I think that was another really great aspect of my journey with Babel, is that sort of that broader community of people that I got to meet, and I think that's a great sort of part of where you sit in sort of civil society and being able to convene folks across different industries. So um, I really enjoyed that part of the program as well.
Yeah, I think it's nice to find. I mean, it used to be like even a year or two ago that there weren't that many people working on this. So to find a bunch of people who are really passionate about, um, doing the real work of governing these systems or assessing these systems, or what have you, was a real treat. Now it feels like there's a flood of interest, and you now work at a really massive organization where responsible AI is a very central part of what they do. AI period is a central part of what they do, and so you must interact with a ton of people that are interested in that. Is that the case, or am I just imagining, or are you still sort of a little siloed?
No, no, definitely. I think we have folks in who are monitoring the public policy landscape, the regulatory landscape. We have folks in engineering who are building sort of technical, controls, and we have folks in research. So we sort of have a pretty broad ecosystem. But I think that sort of speaks to, I know on LinkedIn you recently posted the Keeping Up article, and I think it's important to be able to have folks around you, right? Not just you can't do it all. You can't do all those things that I mentioned by yourself, and it takes an ecosystem of folks to help you learn and keep up with both the regulatory landscape, but also the technology itself, right? Folks who are building solutions. I think those are that's in order to be able to keep up. It's necessary to have partners and people who have different strengths and backgrounds. So I think that's something Babel did, right, in the year that I was there, or in the certificate program. Um, and it's something that's also, yeah, present in our ecosystem as well.
So let's shift gears a little bit to like what you're seeing in the future now. Yeah, because technology, things have been changing a lot. The models keep getting better. I mean, the very fact that like when we say AI, we now think generative AI. We don't think about kind of quote unquote ordinary machine learning kind of models, or like predictive or systems. So things are changing really quickly. What are you seeing like in 2025? What are the things that you're kind of like really interested in understanding more about, working on more, and that are going to be impactful?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion right now around agentic AI or AI agents. It's interesting, sort of being able to unpack that and trying to get more concrete in terms of what are the true novel distinctions as we think about waves of AI. You mentioned traditional AI and algorithms to AI to generative AI, right? I think I've felt it's important to be disciplined about what are the novel capabilities that are really unique in this current sort of wave of what folks are talking about, and then how that challenges our existing responsible AI frameworks, how our existing principles and guidelines like the NIST risk management framework translate over, and then what are the unique risks or heightened risks. So that's sort of been something that's been top of mind for me in my current work. And I think there's still a lot of product truth that's maturing, and we'll have to monitor, claims about what products are have those novel capabilities that sort of warrant.
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, I'm glad you mentioned agentic AI because that's pretty big on our list at Babel, because you know things are moving so fast. Like we have frameworks for how we audit traditional decision support systems, right? So where information is taken in about a situation, there is some output which is going to either automatically do something in some cases, but it's a very discrete thing. Like either you pass you through a hiring, or I give you a loan or not, or it's to inform a human to make that decision, right? We spent a lot of time researching that, like how are we best going to identify the risks there and audit that. But now with agentic AI, now with generative AI, the problem space became very big, because of the inputs were essentially infinite in terms of the parameter space, and the outputs were also kind of effectively infinite. And so you had to choose your battles, and you had to do a much better job about identifying areas of risk. Now we have with agentic AI, because now I'm going to separate LLMs, sort of ordinary LLMs with agentic AI. Now we have a system which has the same complexities of the LLM in terms of an individual inference, now able to execute autonomously, or with some they're not really agents, but they have some agency that way. They can execute things, they can do things on your behalf before they tell you, uh, depending on what kind of guardrails you have built in. And I've seen a lot that don't have any guardrails built in. And so this is a totally different size problem, and it's also a different problem in kind, because you do have um, so many more options for those systems to not wait around for human go ahead. They can just execute something, and so the necessity for guardrails is bigger. But it's moving. Everybody's moving so fast that the guardrail, like the amount of research going into the guardrails, even if you compare like standard evals for LLMs, I spent a lot of work on that. Much less work on how do you have evals for agents. And then we are coming on top as auditors and saying, how do we audit or evaluate whether those guardrails are any good or not? And so that we're even further removed, and there's even less research on that aspect of the assurance of those things. So how are you feeling from your perspective? Do you think there's a lot of movement in an industry in that way, and that there's a lot of emphasis, or do you think that there needs to be more emphasis on that? Maybe that's a false dichotomy, but I just want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of awareness about the need to mature a lot of our resources across the board, across the ecosystem that I mentioned, from sort of evaluation to mitigation in research, engineering, and policy. So I think that's why it's sort of why I brought it up as something that's very top of mind. Um, and it's good that you make a distinction between sort of what we currently have and what we can evaluate, sort of at the LLM layer, or just sort of in our existing generative AI ecosystem, and then think through sort of what's novel in terms of, I kind of come back to, so a specific capability like planning, right? Like taking a high level goal that a user sort of specifies, like, help me travel to Japan, which I'm doing next week. And then does that mean that you want that agent to then book your hotel, or just do research on hotels, or does it book train tickets, or just do research? So I think it's really important to start thinking about concrete boundaries, right, for certain tasks and different things that you as a user are intend to what you want out of your agent. So those are sort of starting to break down what is novel with a certain capability, like planning. Is sort of the approach that I've started to take in Turkey, thinking about governance.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The planning. So this is one component of you know one component of the agent. Like this is what makes it so fascinating and so hard, is that to disaggregate, like you can test input outputs of an LLM a little bit. You can evaluate how effective it is at giving you what you would consider quality outputs. And then you have the planning aspect, which is multiple calls to a large language model. It might not even be the same model or the same version of the model. And it's going to produce some sequence of actions, which would be considered the plan, or potential actions to consider. And then you have the actual execution potentially of that. And where you decide to make that evaluation to say, is this good enough? Is this safe? You can take all of those layers, you can do all of them, or you can try to do the black box of like, I ask it to book me a hotel. How often or how effective is it at understanding my intentions and booking me the correct hotel at the right price, and knowing when I wanted you to do it versus when I just wanted you to tell me what a good hotel might be. So there's so many choices. Like, do you think do we need to tackle all of them at once, or is there a preferred method?
Well, I think like at the end of the day, it's users, it's customers who are using these systems that will choose to adopt them, right? So a user isn't, user trust is inherent to user use, right? If someone wants to use one of these systems effectively, I think that's where we kind of come back on, is it's part of the product design sort of aspect, right? Is so I think insofar as indexing on what users want and what is sort of core to the functionality of what they need to feel like they trust the system is what's core to adoption. So I think what we've discussed in terms of alignment with what I want to use an agent for, in terms of the intended uses, setting those boundaries, those are some pretty basic things that um, I think a lot of folks are thinking about. I think the World Economic Forum report that you had shared was also a very good example of delineating sort of the historical difference between prior to LLMs, right? What we would have thought of as AI agents, non-deterministic agents, or sorry, deterministic agents versus non-deterministic agents, and sort of that probabilistic nature still applies from LLMs to sort of the current wave of agents.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such fascinating research. There's so much empirical work that has to be done, um, from the user preference. Like, what are my intentions? What is going to make me trust this enough to use it? But then there's like trustworthiness, right? I could use it 100 times, and it works fine. I'm starting to trust it, and I'm giving it my API keys to connect to my other services, and then it all of a sudden erases everything that I without me asking, and I'm like, oh my god, how could it have done that? It worked 99 out of these 100 times, but now it just erased everything that I had saved in whatever other platform that I connected it to. I'd given it access to, right? And that's how a lot of these agents work, is you're giving it sort of API access to really other things that you find useful or necessary to run your business or to do whatever. And all it takes is that one long tail event of just destroying everything. And then now the engineers have to think ahead as to what are those catastrophic events that are going to erode the trust, and how do we make it, how do we, then there's the further complication of communicating that to the user. Like, because I say this only from personal experience, that I literally yesterday had this fear. I was using an agent to build a tool, and I gave that agent an API key to another part of our business, and it worked perfectly. It's like, oh, I added this user when I asked it to, and then I just had this realization that it can also destroy users with that same API key. And what if, how do I know, because I don't know how the agent is constructed or what guardrails are there, whether I should trust that it's somehow gonna have the sense that there's a principle of destroying things without asking me that it would need to adhere to. I bet that's not built in, but if I knew it was built in, that would change the way I behave.
Yeah, and I think that's a good. I'd love to flip this question onto you and ask more about, you described what you've experienced sort of like personally, right, in building, but also what products you're seeing, if any, that you've begun to have to do to apply sort of your frameworks or your services, and whether you are seeing more of what we would, others are considering highly agentic sort of systems, or whether they still sort of sit within. I think that's a big thing that's top of mind for me, is what is the current product truth, and what are you seeing in the services that you've had to do so far.
So over the past like 8 months, we have seen an increase in the use of LLMs in the straightforward way that you would imagine people are using LLMs, where they're switching out predictive systems for LLMs. And so we've seen a lot of the systems, even the like people we've audited multiple times in a row, all of a sudden now the systems look different. And so they have these stochastic, their calls to the stochastic system. Now, of course, people will say, well, I turned the temperature down to 0, so it's not really stochastic. But I think this is another thing that I want to educate the community on, is the difference between actual stochastic, or like effectively stochastic, where it's, if I had the same inputs, it would give me the same output, but the inputs are so complex and small changes in those inputs would make radical changes to the output. So it's effectively stochastic, even though it's actually deterministic. Anyway, that's a nerdy sort of deep dive into something that we can talk about later. But the point is, we've seen systems that have these LLMs in them, and now over the past like 3 months, we have seen an increasing number of people, either who were actually auditing or who are looking to get audited by us, who have fully agentic, I wouldn't say fully, they have agentic workflows where there will be decisions that are made by the agents or by LLMs, let's say, just be explicit, by some model, where there will be multiple decisions in a row that get made all without any interface with a human. And then so that's a longer chain of decisions that get made. And so that those are effectively agents. They're a little bit more, maybe more constrained than like a, but I think that's most of the work. Most of the use cases now are that sort of minimally constrained. I send you off on a task, you come back and you check with me at some point. I don't think there are, and you tell me maybe, but there aren't that many systems that I've seen where people that have the maturity of, I want to get audited, that all of a sudden that have like a very long time scale agency where it will operate autonomously, and it will make decisions over time or set its own goals without having checked in with a human at some, on a very regular interval, predefined interval. So that we haven't seen that, but we have seen these sort of quasi agentic workflows.
Right. Yeah, and I think, as I mentioned, like sort of thinking about specific capabilities like long-term memory or tool use, right? I think kind of getting specific to what are the capabilities that are, and making sure that users are aware of that and have the appropriate controls to have those access rights. Yeah, those are all sort of concepts that I think are worth, that aren't, again, necessarily new in terms of our existing responsible AI frameworks, but are just applied, or the management or the controls that we use need to be more specific or thoughtful given the heightened risks. So, but I think a lot of that language, right, that I'd first learned through sort of even my government work on the NIST risk management framework, through the certificate program, like kind of you said at the beginning of the call, it still continues, right? And it's just the way that we're applying this, and we'll continue to apply this as these systems evolve and have new capabilities or have more maturity in terms of the robustness or reliability of these capabilities. I think that'll continue.
So let me finish off with like a question for you about your personal goals for 2025. Right? I think when I think of you, I think of somebody who's very driven to improve yourself, and that was something I always like really appreciated about you in the program, is that you were very driven to like learn new things, grow personally, and that kind of thing. So what are the things you're looking forward to growing into in 2025? What are the things you want to master over that year?
Yeah, I think one thing I in last year, looking back at my journey, you know, in government, thinking at that, I mentioned that 10,000 foot level, doing a lot of writing, thinking about sort of AI policy in the way that we, you know, at a national strategy level, think about what our values are, workforce development, R&D spending, down to sort of agency use, and then now like in industry, thinking about product a little bit more concretely. I want to make sure that I'm keeping up with sort of the external world, and especially in civil society, right? And I think that's a big goal of mine, is to there's a lot of work through organizations like BABL and Partnership for AI and All Tech is Human, and I think it's, to my point about not going at it alone and having to keep up by yourself or thinking about these new frameworks. I want to continue to learn from folks, within Microsoft, but also outside of Microsoft. So I think that's a big goal of mine. Because sometimes we use slightly different words. We're talking about the same thing, right? We can spend a lot of time talking about different terms, but a lot of us are thinking about the same problems. And I think that's a big goal of mine, is to maintain a connection to the community that sort of first introduced me to this space, which includes sort of Babel. And again, I think a lot of that is my fault for maybe not engaging with you guys a lot last year, but I have a lot to.
Well, you've been busy. I mean, I think most of us view Microsoft as being at the center of what's happening here. I think, and whether that's fair or not, but I think both in terms of the technology advancement and through partnerships with various places like OpenAI and the way it's been built in, but also from the responsible AI front, Microsoft has always been kind of a leading organization there, and so I'm super excited. I was super excited to have you get into Microsoft and be working there because, uh, I think it's great to have good people like you on the inside, so to speak, um, and working at the cutting edge, which is exciting. And I think we're excited to have you come back to the wider community as well to share some of your stuff and some of the way you conceptualize things. And I think that language barrier, or using the right language, is important, because I think you can miscommunicate or talk. You need to be expressing, you meaning companies, need to be expressing themselves in ways that can be understood by civil society, can be understood by policymakers, can be understood by the average person interacting or using these systems. And so that's a pretty important thing. And I think you're a great communicator, and you're also uh, have that policy hat on. And so you're a great person to sort of keep up with what does that communication need to look like in order to be effective. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I'm gonna leave it here, just because I think we could probably talk for like hours and hours. And so you're one of the ones I want to call back, in a few months, just to see how 2025 is shaping up. If you're listening to this on a podcast, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. That does us a lot of good. We appreciate it. And we'll catch you later on the next Lunchtime Babbling.